Hello watch lovers, welcome back to the channel. My name is Stian and today we have something that you haven't seen on YouTube before. This is a JLC Reverso Squadra GMT Chronograph. Ooh, try saying that fast 10 times in a row. We see it has a bit of an interesting date, so it's a big date, but those dates aren't entirely correct. So we're going to have to see what's up with that. Turning the crown the other way, we see we turn the GMT hand at the bottom here at 6 o'clock. Then if we try to adjust the hands, then we see the GMT hand indicates that here is midnight, but it's still the 31st. Oh, there the date jumped to the 32nd. Finally. I thought it would never go to the 32nd. And we're not even in a leap year. So between the date going a little bit further than what is generally acknowledged as the last day of the month, we also saw that the date changed over at 5 o'clock, which is not good. This is a really big watch, at least in my view. Given that I work mostly on vintage watches, I'm used to 35 millimeters and so. This watch is actually 35 millimeters across, but it's 41 millimeters tall, so yeah. And with those huge lugs, it really does look quite imposing on the wrist. 51 millimeters lug to lug, so yeah, not a small watch. It is a reverso, so we can of course turn it the other way. And then we can see the movement inside. This is, as we see, the caliber 754. When I said you haven't seen it on YouTube before, you've probably seen reviews of the watch if you're interested in it, but you haven't seen it picked apart in all of its couple of hundred parts. So that's what we're going to do in this video. First though, let's have a look at how it runs before the service. I'm going to put it on a time grapher. What we're looking for is mainly straight lines, and that's very nice as we see. Yes, the amplitude is not quite what we like, but that we can fix. So let's get going on taking out the outer case first. The construction is quite similar in most of the Reverso models. We have these screws that tie the lugs to the cover, the back cover if you will. And then we can ultimately take out the inner case. So the history of the Reverso goes back to 1931, and as I'm sure a lot of people know, it was sort of the result of a polo match in India between English players. So they wanted a watch that could be more resistant to breaking the crystal on the watch, and thus the watch that could flip to have a solid steel back instead of breakable glass was invented. The size of the original Reverso was quite a lot smaller than this one, obviously. It was 24 by 38 millimeters, so quite a big difference. I do actually have a very old Reverso on my bench, and it will be ready pretty soon. So I look forward to that video. Especially over the last couple of decades, however, the Reverso has taken on a pretty different role. It is the most iconic JLC for sure. And it's also spawned a lot of very complicated models in the last couple of decades. This one is quite complicated, but you have them with double-sided tourbillons and yeah, quite a lot of complications going into them. So coming back to this watch, we took off the outer covers and also this top cover. And then I also unscrewed the movement from the top of the case and the chapter ring. So quite a few screws here. On the top of the case and also at the bottom of the case now we have these springy, I'm not sure what really to call them, but these are the ones that allow the mechanism, the inner case, to then tilt back and forth inside the outer case. So we're going to take the movement out of the, running out of things to say here now, the inner case, I suppose, here. And there we also have the spring-loaded pushers. So yeah, quite a lot of unwrapping to do to get to the movement on this watch. But we finally have it. So we're going to put the stem and the crown back in, and then we can align the hands and take them all off. So the owner of this watch is Marc. From what I remember, he told me that the watch is from 2006. Marc bought it new back then. It has been serviced before. We're going to see there are a few marks here and there, but it is in very fine condition. See, the dial and the hands are pristine, and the case is also in very nice condition. We're going to put the hands into this little safekeeping box. We're also going to put in the rest of the hands as we get to them, plus the dial and the date disc, of course. The dial itself is actually just pressed into the movement. There are no dial screws. And then we get to see the date mechanism. So let's see how many extra days of the month this baby can create. 36, 37, 38, 39. And then it's sort of the 10th, I suppose. So there is obviously an issue with this big date cross somehow. We're going to see what that is later. Let's just disassemble everything first and get it cleaned up. I'm going to put this in that little safekeeping box as well. And then we can take off the plate for the date disc. Now, what often happens in watches that haven't been serviced for a while is that parts might stick together. So that's why I also always check the underside of these things. We see one of the wheels here has indeed stuck. Should be on top of this little post there. For now, of course, we'll remove it anyway, but we're going to have to remember that when we put the watch back together. We're going to rapidly take off the rest of the parts. We're going to let the keyless works in place for now. Just take off all the date works. Here we're just trying to understand how it works. That's also important before taking parts off. Don't just unscrew things before we know what function they have. And then we can put the dial together with the other parts in this little box and put it away safely. Let's then turn to the train side. There's another little plate here that covers the automatic works. And what have we here? Why, if it isn't Seiko's magic lever. So even the Swiss believe that the Japanese are better at watchmaking. Well, at least for the automatic winding, that is. And no, it's not patent infringement. The patent has long since expired, so it's completely allowed. But it is interesting to see. I've talked very highly of the Seiko Magic Lever before, and it is, in my view, easily the best automatic winding. So fun to see that even JLC, the watchmaker's watchmaker, think that the Japanese, or specifically Seiko, does that better. Let's then have a look at the chronograph mechanism. It is column wheel operated. Works as most chronographs, start and stop at the top pusher and then reset with the bottom pusher. There is a safety mechanism here, so if the chronograph is engaged, which it is at this point, then we cannot reset it. So we'll have to pause the chronograph and then we can reset it. It is a vertical clutch chronograph, as we will see when we start taking off more parts. So with the chronograph bridge off, we can have a closer look at the chronograph mechanism. For those of you who would very easily qualify for the term watch nerd, you will recognize that this movement is based on the Frederick Piguet 1185. Basically what JLC did was to take the 1185, put in Seiko's magic lever and then an extra barrel and call it the JLC 754. It does of course touch upon what is an in-house movement, but this is a very common practice that you take proven technology, then put a little few extra things on it and then call it your own. Yeah. It is a solid movement. There are a few things I definitely do not like about it, and one thing in particular that I hate, but that is JLC more than the base movement. I'm gonna see that in a second. You can see it already if you watch where the balance was. We are almost down to the base movement. Just gonna take off the last parts of the chronograph mechanism. And then we can start on the base movement. So did you see it yet? Let me know in the comments what you think about that particular little piece. In the meantime, we're going to uncover another part that was, let's say, inspired by Seiko. And that part is this one, the hack. Also looks very Seiko-esque. Here we have the two barrels, so that gives this watch a very good power reserve. I believe it's 70 something hours, but I could be mistaken. And then finally, a shim. Shame on you, JLC. Shame on you. What is this? Seriously. That is scandalous in my book. And just to clarify why this upsets me, and it is genuine upset. I'm not joking. I think this is truly horrible for a watchmaker of JLC's reputation. So one of the most important things in a watch is how the balance oscillates, of course. And the balance needs to have a very accurate end shake, which is basically the distance from jewel bearing to jewel bearing. So if the end shake is too big, you can imagine that the balance sort of wobbles up and down with the watch changing positions. And that's not good for accuracy and for consistency of the timekeeping. So what you do is to make sure that that end shake is basically as small as possible while still leaving enough room for letting the watch function properly. But instead of making the effort of ensuring proper end shake, they just put in a little metal plate. And the reason that is so upsetting to a watchmaker is that it's just lazy and arrogant. In a watch you pay many, many thousands for, you would expect them to actually make the effort to properly ensure the end shake. As regular viewers of my channel know, I am of the belief that watches aren't timekeeping devices anymore. They are luxury items. So we should demand that from the manufacturer as well, I think, that they put their best effort into it. Anyway, we got all the parts off. There are a lot of them, both in the various casings and of course in the mechanism itself. We're going to put that into the cleaning machine. And do let me know in the comments below what you think about that shim that I got all hot and sweaty about. if you think that is okay in a watch like this, or if that's something that should only be found in old Soviet watches. While preparing for the cleaning machine, let me also give a warm thanks to my YouTube and Patreon members. You guys really make it worthwhile. Thanks so much. And if you have not yet become a member, you can check out what the benefits of that are by clicking on the join button below, or by going to Patreon on this URL. And no, I do not know what the other 88 vintage watch services Patreon members do, but anyway, let's enjoy the mechanical marvel of the watch cleaning machine. Always nice to see someone else do the work. Now, I consider myself a pretty zen guy. Actually, watchmaking really does let you get into the zone where you sit there and you work on these tiny pieces, and yeah, hours just fly. But I did say there were a few things that bothered me with this movement, and one of those things is the size of the shock settings. This is not a small movement, even though it's much smaller than a 7750 family, for instance. But the shock settings are just minuscule, super tiny. And I do also vastly prefer Inca block to KIF, so that's another thing. So you might have seen that I immersed the escapement parts in Epilam, fix or drop. So I first of all cleaned the pivots on the pallet fork and the escape wheel. And then I'm going to put a tiny little drop of oil at the center of the cap jewels. And then we can place the chaton on top. So obviously there are two main reasons for my annoyance with these tiny little shock settings. And they're both related to the same thing, to be honest. The first is that I'm getting old and grumpier by the day. So you better watch out. Yeah, I'm talking to you. You know who I mean. And the second thing is, as I'm aging, I do feel my eyesight is really not improving, to put it that way. So for these shock settings, I actually had to use a microscope because, well, not sure if it was a combination of the light or whatever it was, or just that I'm getting old. But I really had trouble seeing those tiny little prongs there. But I did manage to get them in the end, so let's see if the balance oscillates. And that looks fine. So let's get on with the rest of the movement. So when we were reusing a mainspring, then we will lubricate the barrel a little bit. Then we can use one of our many tools. When you're working with watches regularly, you do need quite a few tools. And these mainspring winders are quite invaluable. There is an argument to be made, of course, that you can always put in a new mainspring. But the thing is, it's not necessarily always possible to find the fitting mainspring. And it's also a little bit of a waste of money a lot of the time, because the original mainspring might just be fine. I only showed one of the barrels, but we have both barrels ready, so we can start on the other parts. I'm just first going to put in the springs on the underside of those couple of bridges. Then we have this little locking plate for the setting lever here. We're just going to place that now, and then we'll get back to that in a very short while. The two barrels are run in sequence, and that's what gives the watch a very long power reserve. It's of course always nice to see jeweled bearings as well for the barrels. There is a little bit of a mix of the screws. So one of these screws is blued. That's the one that's going to be visible, so that's why. Then for the setting lever, we can put that on the other side, but we actually have to hold it in place with a little bit of Rodico when we lock it into that plate on the other side of the movement. So let's do that under the microscope. Here we have the setting lever there, and then we just slide that lock under, and then it's going to be kept in place by the bridge on top of it. So let's look at the chronograph wheel with a vertical clutch under the microscope. So you can see I'm pressing down on one side of this cone here, and that flexes it on the other side, and then we can put our oiler in and lubricate the clutch. And yeah, it is difficult to hold something steady, so it looks steady under a 40x magnification. So one thing you might have noticed, even though I didn't actually spell it out, is that this watch does not have running seconds. So most chronographs have a small counter, small hand, that shows the running seconds, but not this one. One of the, let's say, benefits, if you will, of the vertical clutch is, however, that it's better for the chronograph to run than not run. And the reason for that is that when you stop the chronograph, then you actually put a little bit of friction on the locking mechanism. So it's better to simply let it run. So that probably explains why this watch does not have running seconds. Another little strange thing with the movement is that there is no plate for the winding pinion to rest against. So that's why you saw me put another little piece of Rodico on the other side. Doing that simply to make the winding pinion stay in place until we can put the stem through it. So I mentioned already that the Frederick Piguet 1185 is the movement that the JLC 754 is based on. It is one of the most common movements for higher end chronographs nowadays. So that's a movement that you will come across quite a lot if you work on modern chronographs and, let's say, higher priced ones. And what you will find is that chronographs that have been designed in, let's say, more recent decades tend to be vertical clutch chronographs. There are a few benefits to vertical clutch versus horizontal clutch, which you might think of as sort of the traditional classic chronograph system. But the vertical clutch has a much smoother start. So you're never going to see sort of a stutter when the chronograph hands start moving, especially the second hand, because that's the biggest one. Another characteristic of horizontal clutch chronographs is that if you have an hour counter, then that counter is typically driven directly from the barrel. One of the reasons is that it takes quite a lot of force to actually run it. But in vertical clutch chronographs, it's the other way around. We're going to see that a little bit later, that the hour counter is directly running from the chronograph wheel. Of course, aesthetically, I would say that the horizontal clutch just looks better. And perhaps it's more logically easy to understand as well, but yeah. If you are working on chronographs, then you probably should get used to vertical clutch sooner or later. So while discussing that, I've put together the keyless works. Just testing that everything works as it should. And then we can continue on the train side. Another characteristic of the vertical clutch chronographs is that the chronograph is pretty much integral to the base movement as well, because that is the wheel that transfers the power to the escape wheel. So while it's good practice to build the base movement first and make sure it runs well before you start building the chronograph, then that's a little bit different with this type of movement. So I am putting on the chronograph bridge here, but there are very few chronograph parts underneath it. So the reason I'm doing that is that I do want to test the movement first, because that will give me assurance that everything is good before we start putting together the chronograph. But it makes it a little bit extra work. Let's then lubricate the pallet fork. We see there's a bubble, and that's because of the epilam. That's a little bit much, so I took a bit off of that one. We do not worry that the first tooth on the escape wheel takes a lot of the lubricant from the pallet stone. As the escape wheel rotates, that lubricant will spread over the entire number of teeth. Alright, then we can get back to the movement. What I didn't show is that I did let the balance run for a couple of minutes before lubricating the pallet stones. And that is to scrape a little path, if you will, in the middle of the pallet stone for the lubrication. So then it will be held in place there by epilam on both sides. So having lubricated all the different jewel holes, let's demagnetize the movement and then check it on the time grapher again. And that looks pretty alright. We're gonna be happy with that. We want the watch to run a little bit fast. And when we get the automatic module in place, then the amplitude will also rise by 10 to 20 degrees. So that's alright. Then we can start putting in the chronograph parts. If you watched my Psycho 6139 video a while back, the Psycho Pulsations watch, then you probably will recognize a lot of the parts from that one. Well, maybe you won't recognize the parts, but at least the functionality. So vertical chronographs will have these two pincers, one on each side, that then arrests the clutch, or stops it, when you want to stop the chronograph. When you want the chronograph to run, they are resting in the position they are in now. So here we're putting in the hour counting reduction train. There is a wheel that will be directly flipped over by a finger on the chronograph wheel, and then reduced down to the hour counter wheel. The manual version of this movement, or rather of the FP movement, the 1180, is actually very thin, only about 3.8 millimeters, I believe. Part of the reason is this very flat hammer. That is a very cool feature of this movement. So the two brass wheels that we see resting on top of the hammer are then intermediary wheels driven by the chronograph finger. The larger brass wheel that I just put on is the minute counter. Here we have the operating lever, very simple. It just flicks the column wheel forward. And then we have the reset lever. And yeah, I know the intermediate hour counter wheel has come out of place. Don't worry, we're going to put that back in place before we're putting the bridge on. When putting on a bridge with lots of pivots, as this one, then it is very important to be careful, cautious. Take your time, make sure all the pivots are in the holes before you start screwing any screws down. One little tip, if you're screwing a bridge down and you feel it's kind of springy when you're screwing it, that it doesn't just screw down and then sits tight, then something is blocking it. So if you feel it's sort of springy against your screwdriver, do not tighten it. Alright, let's start the chronograph and see how the various intermediate wheels are being flicked over, if it's smooth or not. Let's speed it up a little bit. So here comes the finger now to the intermediate hour counting wheel. Flips over all right. And then it rotates another 120 degrees or so. And flips over the minute hand. So we're going to be okay with that, and we can then start putting together the automatic module. The most psycho, let's say, inspired part of the watch. So the eccentric pinion on the underside of this driving wheel here rotates the magic lever so that it sequentially pushes and pulls on the silver wheel here that then winds the barrel. Very elegant design. 3 parts for creating a very efficient automatic winding. And with that in place, we can then put on the cover plate for it. All these screws are tiny. The whole movement is rather small actually, but still. With all that in place, we can then turn the movement over and start working on the date mechanism. Again, most of this is standard FP 1185, but of course the big date and also the GMT part is something JLC have put on top of that. So what you'll commonly see with big dates is that the date disk has been altered. So we can see the numbers do not go from 1 to 31 as normal date disks do, but they go in cycles from 0 to 9 and then with an alteration for the 31st. There's also 2 sets of teeth, one for the normal driving wheel and then one for the big date. The cross that we saw previously. So we're going to have to put the cross in so that it meshes properly with that upper set of teeth. And then rotates so it doesn't show 32 and so forth anymore, because that's not convenient if you want to plan business appointments and stuff. Saying, yes, my agenda is completely open on the 32nd. So what probably happened before with the erroneous date is that this jumper at the bottom of the picture here probably came out of its position due to a shock or similar, and then failed to properly propel the cross. This wheel here is the GMT wheel, and then we put the cross on. We have to make sure that's in the right position. Let's check it. 20. Darn it. I had a free day on the 32nd and now it's gone. Alright, so we can press the dial back on and then put on the hands. Let's also have a look at how rapid the date changeover is. So that was the sound of the movement. So yeah, it is pretty strong. So now we found the midnight. We can then put the GMT hand at 24 hours. And we can then also put our hour hand at 24 or midnight. And then let's check the alignment before we put on the minute hand. That looks all right. When putting on the hands, we basically drive them down so that they're flush with the top of the wheel that they're sitting on. And then we have to make sure that the hands are parallel to the dial and not touching the dial or another hand. And that looks all right. A good thing about the movement is that the hammer is currently arresting all the chronograph counters. So that means we can more accurately put the chronograph hands on. It's not easy to align these hands. So if you're working on chronographs and you're frustrated by it, I also have to take these hands off a couple of times typically. Let's start the chronograph and run it for a while in high speed and then look at the reset. If you look closely at the hour counter at 9 o'clock here, you will see that that hand also moves a little bit forward every time the seconds hand does a full minute rotation. So that looks all right. We can then case the movement. Well, let's say begin to case the movement because it's got a lot of cases to go into. So the movement itself, as I mentioned, the manual version of the movement is actually the thinnest chronograph. Thinnest I know about, at least. But this watch is actually 13.5 millimeter thick. So there's an additional centimeter. Well, some of it is the automatic works, of course. Some of it is the GMT part and the big date. But there's a whole lot of case also. But that's the price you have to pay. It is a complicated watch. A lot of stuff going on inside it. The rotor is a ball bearing one, so we're going to use a Lubetta V106 to lubricate the ball bearing. And then we can put in the case clamps and then all the various screws to hold everything together. And then finally yet another decorative plate. And more screws. So one question I always sort of ask myself, and which might be interesting for you guys as well, is it a fun watch to work on? Not really. I always like to work on chronographs. I think chronographs and complicated watches are much more fun to work on than anything else. But there's just so much casing on this watch. It's just driving me crazy, man. And couple that with a lot of tiny screws. Those tiny shock settings. And that shim, man. Seriously. Yeah, I know I should stop talking about it, but still. Anyway, it is a very nice watch. And it does work as it should again now. So let's hope Marc will be happy with this watch. I'm going to put the strap back on, and before seeing the watch on the wrist, I want to remind everyone that at vintagewatchservices.eu you'll always find more than 100 beautiful vintage watches, and as a YouTube subscriber you can use this coupon code for 10% off. And there we have it. Marc's Reverso Squadra GMT chronograph. It is a very cool watch. Complicated, big for me, even though I'm a big guy, but it does look cool, I must say. I hope you liked this video. If you did, then do click like and subscribe. I'll be back with another video shortly. Until then, ta-ta.